A topic that recurs frequently in Western media is befuddlement over the country Hungary and its politics. A recurring theme is the European Union trying to make a universal policy, like a Declaration on Human Rights or its principles, and time and again these efforts are blocked or disrupted by Hungary. While the country remains a parliamentary republic with a prime minister, it's gone through constitutional changes and has shifted toward authoritarianism in a manner similar to Russia and Turkey. While Western countries have long internalized democratic principles, Hungary became known in the 2010s for its shift to so-called illiberal democracy. While the country has become celebrated by the right wing in the United States, it remains a perplexing country to observers, particularly those baffled by its subversion and undermining of the EU whenever the bloc tries to make an act of unanimity. What I'd argue is that geography and history lead to psychological consequences in a people. And if you study the region, you can understand the origins of Hungary's conduct and actions. In a previous video, we talked about how the experiences of Western and Eastern Europeans were very different. We explored how Western Europe developed more economically, developing middle classes and modern systems of government, while the East remained behind, agricultural and feudal. I talked about how Eastern countries experienced invasion, partition, and dissolution, in addition to being trapped behind the Iron Curtain for 50 years, events that traumatized their peoples and deprived them of optimism about the future. I argued that Eastern Europeans actually had a more mature understanding of the human condition and consequence, having a greater insight into the tragedy and fatalism of life compared to their more privileged peers in the West. It's true if you compare the Dutch, English, and Americans with the Russians, Poles, and Hungarians. They have very different outlooks on life. Not having experienced the national calamities of Eastern countries, the West tends to have a higher sense of openness and a greater optimism about the future. One of the insights of neuroscience is that trauma has a physical impact on the brain, increasing the size of the amygdala, which manages the body's responses to fear and danger. If a whole people, like the Jews for example, experience a trauma, it leaves a physical impact on their collective psyche. One formative event for Hungary was their defeat to the Turks at Mohacs in the early 16th century, which resulted in the Ottoman occupation of the country for 100 years. Another was their occupation by the Red Army after World War II, which resulted in Soviet domination of the country until the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1898. These events have caused Hungarians to have an altered understanding of what constitutes the good. Compared to their peers in Western Europe, they have diminished expectations, preferring the basic goods of security, ethnic preservation, and independence from rule by a foreign civilization. This is very different from cultures like the Dutch, who have higher expectations of individual liberty and expect progress in economic and social development. If we want to understand Orbanism and the authoritarianism that has developed in Hungary, we can look at its antecedents in history. Orban's government fits in a historical pattern, where Hungary experiences its periods of greatest stability, if not prosperity, under so-called regencies, authoritarian governments that rule in the place of the monarchy. In a previous video, we talked about the idea of benign paternalism, and we see that form of government here. Hungary had an authoritarian regime under John Hunyadi, the war hero who defeated the Turks at Belgrade and maintained stability prior to the reign of his son. This system of government repeated in the interwar period, when Nicholas Horthy governed the country in place of the monarchy. Similar to Hunyadi, he maintained stability and navigated the country's independence through the politics of being trapped between two totalitarian powers. With these examples, we can make an argument that certain cultures lean toward natural forms of government, with countries like Germany and Hungary having historically been ruled by authoritarian regimes. Another question is why the Hungarians are so hostile to foreign migration, particularly those from the Islamic world, like the Syrians who immigrated to Europe during the Syrian Civil War. The country gained notoriety for building a border wall against migrants during this period. While the refugee crisis elicited sympathy and humanity from countries like Holland and Germany, many were surprised to see the extreme xenophobia of Hungary. To understand the origins of this, you have to look to history and look at two national events that affected the country's psychology. Its Islamophobia dates back to the 16th century, when the Turks conquered and partitioned the kingdom, occupying it for the next century. Its Crusader history, like that of the Reconquista in Spain, affirmed a civilizational identity for the country. This resulted in a deep antipathy and suspicion of Islam as foreign and alien. Another national event was the migration of the Cumans in the Middle Ages. A nomadic people from the steppe who fled the Mongols, the Cumans were invited to settle in the Pannonian Basin. One of the kings of Hungary even took a Cuman as a wife, resulting in his successor being ethnically half the new minority. Internal troubles developed, and the Cumans rose in a revolution, just as the country needed unity against the Mongols. Like the Turkish conquest, this resulted in a long-term xenophobia and hostility to migration. Another question is why Hungary is such a subversive country in the European Union. It seems to have the psychology of wanting to watch the world burn, vetoing and undermining measures that would otherwise have unanimous consent. From a psychological point of view, this could arise from someone who experiences a deep injustice and has to live with it. Such a psychology, if given power, would want to use it to remind others of what they perceive as an upset moral order to the universe. So this derives from Hungary's experience after World War I. After the defeat of Austria-Hungary, the Allied powers signed the Treaty of Trianon with Hungary, dismantling the borders of the kingdom. With ethnic minorities making up the majority of its outlying territories, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia received partitions of the historic Kingdom of Hungary. While the Austrian Empire had been an imperialistic power, expanding and taking territory outside of its historical region, the grievance of Hungarians lied in the longevity of their kingdom, dating back for 1,000 years. This argument was defeated by Wilson's idea of ethnic self-determination, along with the reality that might makes right, the country having chosen the wrong side in the World War. So the analogy Hungarians give is if the United States lost Texas, California, and Florida, and how that would change the consciousness of the remaining part of the country. As I said, this is the origin of their subversive behavior in the EU, wanting to annoy other nations over a moral grievance that the country has had for 100 years. So to surmise, the regencies of Hunyadi and Horthy are origins for Orbanism. Hungary's wanting to watch the world burn attitude in the EU comes from a grievance over the Treaty of Trianon. Their hostility to migrants, particularly those from the Islamic world, is a legacy of the Turkish conquest. They value security and conservatism, with an enhanced fear and danger response as a result of historical trauma. And they have the Eastern European understanding of tragedy, a consequence of historical tragedies.